At present, if we compare the peoples of Europe and Asia, we can observe significant differences. However, recent studies have shown that several thousand years ago, conquerors who came from Asia took over much of Europe, and modern Europeans are descendants of those people. Today, I will present concrete evidence showing that 90% of the ancestors of European peoples came from Asia. Archaeological trace of Asian conquerors. With the development of archaeology, researchers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries encountered an unusual phenomenon during excavations that was widespread across different regions of Europe. In various parts of Europe, large pits and human remains buried within them were discovered. Analysis showed that these bones belonged to people who lived approximately 4,800 to 5,000 years ago. These findings indicated that a large-scale war took place in Europe around 5,000 years ago. Initially, it was assumed that the cause of this mass death might have been a natural disaster. However, research findings refuted this view. It was determined that the discovered bones belonged to men, and all of them had died as a result of an attack at the hands of enemies. The bones clearly showed traces of wounds from arrowheads and axe blows. Moreover, the remains of the people buried in the pits had been thrown in haphazardly. In such a situation, the human remains of those who died and were thrown into pits, as well as the occurrence of such cases in Europe, and the fact that the bones mostly belonged to men, indicate that a brutal external invasion took place. Due to YouTube's strict policies, I cannot openly share many details, and I did not publish on YouTube an image showing the conditions in which people who suffered from these invaders' attacks died. You can view the full, uncensored information by visiting my Telegram channel. Genetic and cultural traces of the conquerors. When geneticists joined the research, the picture became clearer. It was found that around 5,000 years ago, the main male haplogroups in Europe were G2A and I2, haplogroups of the indigenous Europeans. However, after a large-scale invasion, these haplogroups sharply declined, and they were replaced by men belonging to haplogroups R1a and R1b. The studies show that during that catastrophic period, about 90% of European men suffered demographic losses. The attack was primarily directed at men, while women survived. Genetic analysis showed that local women remained, and subsequent generations descended from local women and incoming male conquerors. The conquerors belonging to haplogroups R1a and R1b brought with them a foreign culture. This new culture is known in science as the Yamnaya culture. These invaders, who formed the Yamnaya culture, completely displaced the indigenous cultures in the parts of Europe they invaded. Before their arrival, the linear pottery culture was widespread in Central Europe, the funnel beaker culture in Northern Europe, and the Neolithic cultures of Spain and France in Southern Europe. All of them were completely destroyed. According to archaeological data, the origins of the Yamnaya culture emerged in the steppes of present-day Western Kazakhstan and the Black Sea region, that is, in the ancient homeland of nomadic Turkic peoples. In modern times, the empire of Genghis Khan is often considered one of the most brutal conquering forces in history. Genghis Khan and several of his descendants inflicted severe demographic losses on the peoples of the regions they conquered. As a result of their campaigns, tens of millions of people died. However, they did not completely annihilate the nations they attacked, such as the Arabs, Persians, and Chinese. These peoples have survived to the present day. Likewise, during the First and Second World Wars, which are considered among the most devastating in history, humanity suffered enormous losses, but entire nations were not completely wiped out. This war, organized by ancient nomads in Europe 5,000 years ago, far surpasses the First and Second World Wars in terms of the percentage of human losses. This is because genetic studies have shown that about 90% of European men did not survive, the territory from which the conquerors originated. The nomadic conquerors who attacked Europe originated from the territory of present-day Western Kazakhstan and the Black Sea region. This can be demonstrated by the Yamnaya culture they formed. However, if we consider their genetics, specifically the haplogroups R1a and R1b, it has been established that these haplogroups originated in Asia. This is evidenced by the discovery of human remains known as the Malta boy. The Malta boy refers to the remains of a 3 to 4-year-old child discovered in the 1920s in the Irkutsk region of modern-day Russia, in Siberia. Genetic analysis conducted in 2013 showed that this individual lived approximately 24,000 years ago and carried haplogroup R. Based on the results of this study, specialists classified haplogroup R as part of a group of haplogroups of Asian origin. This haplogroup was also widely rasprostranena among the ancient Turkic peoples, the heirs of the nomads. Moreover, it is still widely found today among Kazakhs living in western Kazakhstan, which is considered one of the centers of the Yamnaya culture. This indicates that these nomadic conquerors moved into Europe from Asia. The weapons of the conquerors. The nomadic conquerors had weaponry and military skills that were among the most advanced of their time. First, the invaders were nomads, and their army mainly consisted of cavalry. Archaeologists have identified traces of the earliest nomads in northern Kazakhstan. These traces are known as the Botai culture. The Botai culture dates to approximately 5,700 to 5,100 years ago. The people of the Botai culture and those who formed the Yamnaya culture that invaded Europe were related. At settlements associated with the Botai culture, numerous horse bones have been discovered. The domestication of horses is evidenced by traces of kumis, fermented mare's milk, as well as wear marks on the jawbones caused by the use of bits. The domestication of the horse by ancient Turkic peoples in the territory of Kazakhstan allowed them to develop a nomadic culture. A nomadic way of life provided significant military advantages. Mounted nomads could launch sudden attacks on sedentary peoples, similar to modern drones, and withdraw when necessary, inflicting continuous losses on the enemy. It was very difficult for infantry-based sedentary groups to fight against mounted warriors. Moreover, even when defeated sedentary groups tried to retreat, it was not easy for them to escape from cavalry. Another important military achievement of the nomads who invaded Europe was the use of war chariots. In territories of Russia close to Kazakhstan, as well as in Kazakhstan itself, especially in Arkaim, Sintashta, Bagazi Dandibai culture, Tazmola culture, and Karatau, two-wheeled chariots and their traces have been discovered, and images of two-wheeled chariots have been found in Tamgali. These findings indicate that two-wheeled chariots were widely used in the territory of Kazakhstan. Four-wheeled carts were used for transporting goods, while two-wheeled carts were designed not for transport, but for military purposes, for warfare. The presence of a large number of such war chariots indicates that the ancient Kazakhs were a highly militarized society. Archaeological research has shown that the territory of Kazakhstan was one of the earliest regions where war chariots came into use. Naturally, for nomads who traveled on horseback, it was quite normal to be among the first to adopt the use of wheeled vehicles. Archaeological research has clearly shown that the conquerors who shook Europe primarily waged war using chariots. Carts and their depictions found in the territory of Kazakhstan further confirmed the region from which these warriors originated. Two-wheeled horse-drawn war chariots inflicted not only physical, but also a significant psychological impact on enemy forces. According to scholars, during attacks using carts, a terrifying noise was produced by the friction of wheels and wood, which, combined with the shouts of the nomads, instilled fear in settled populations. Under such conditions, even before the battle began, the opposing forces were gripped by fear and were forced to retreat. At that time, stirrups and saddles had not yet been invented, making it difficult to fight by shooting a bow while riding a horse. Therefore, fighting from chariots was the most effective method. One of the two warriors in the chariot controlled the reins, while the other rained arrows on the enemy and engaged in combat. When the distance closed, spears and axes came into play. In the society of ancient nomads, great attention was paid to the quality of weapons. Metallurgy was highly developed in the territory of Kazakhstan. Archaeological research has demonstrated that the inhabitants of present-day Kazakhstan were among the first to master metallurgy. The Zhezkazgan mine alone surpassed the rest of Eurasia in terms of metallurgical production volume. This large-scale manufacturing included a vast array of weaponry. Numerous axes, spears, and other types of arms, alongside ancient mines, have been discovered at these sites. These facts suggest that ancient nomadic populations possessed a level of armament that was mass-scale and widespread across society. The renowned Kazakh geologist Kanish Satpayev believed that more than 1 million tons of copper ore had been mined and smelted in Zhezkazgan. And this is only Zhezkazgan. Besides it, in other regions, ancient Kazakhs also extracted metal and produced weapons. These factors made them a society that produced the largest amount of weapons in the world. If we examine the settlements of ancient peoples in Europe before the arrival of nomadic conquerors, we can see that they were mainly inhabited by sedentary agricultural populations. Weapon production there was also limited. In other words, ancient Europeans were predominantly peaceful people not accustomed to warfare. At that time, most Europeans used weapons made of stone. Meanwhile, among the ancient Kazakhs, that is, the carriers of the Yamnaya culture, metallurgy and copper extraction were highly developed. Weapons made of copper were superior to stone weapons in every respect. For example, stone arrows, due to their weight, could not travel long distances. Moreover, their tips were not sharp enough, so they could not penetrate deeply into the enemy's body. In contrast, copper arrows, being lighter, could fly much farther, and their sharp tips allowed them to inflict much more severe damage on the opponent. Overall, copper, due to its flexibility and relative softness, was very important for making sharp spear and arrowheads, knives, and short swords. Copper had a tremendous impact on the development of the nomadic way of life. Sharp knives were convenient for slaughtering livestock and cutting meat, allowing warriors to quickly prepare food during campaigns. Course of the war. Although no written historical sources about the war of this period have survived, archaeological and genetic evidence allows us to understand how events unfolded and to describe a number of circumstances. Nomads who came from the territory of western Kazakhstan and the Black Sea region were able to organize sudden raids using cavalry. It was impossible to predict when and where their attacks would occur. War chariots were used in large-scale campaigns. In open terrain, they left infantry with no chance. They fired arrows from a distance, and when closing in, they struck with spears or simply trampled them. The use of copper and bronze weapons gave a significant advantage over people armed with stone tools. In this war, approximately 90% of European men perished. This indicates that the nomads did not spare the men of defeated groups. They easily caught up with retreating enemy units on horseback. However, Europe is not entirely made up of open plains. There are plenty of dense forests, swamps, and mountainous regions where horse movement is difficult. Why men did not survive even in these areas was determined through archaeological research. Studies of the Yamnaya culture revealed that armed individuals were buried together with dogs. It was also established that these were not ordinary dogs, but hunting dogs. The burial of hunting dogs together with armed individuals does not rule out their use in warfare. After all, following the people of the Yamnaya culture, a group known as the Sumerians lived in the territory of western Kazakhstan. You can see an ancient image that has come down to us associated with the Sumerians. It depicts two armed horsemen riding at full speed, with dogs running behind them. A person lying on the ground can also be seen. This image may indicate that the Sumerians used dogs in warfare, possibly to track and pursue their enemies. The Sumerians are considered direct descendants of the Yamnaya culture. Therefore, it can be assumed that during the nomads' campaigns into Europe, in difficult terrains such as mountains and swamps, where horses moved with difficulty, they may have used dogs against their opponents. Such a significant disparity in weaponry meant that the ancient populations of Europe were unable to resist the nomads arriving from the steppes. They suffered a crushing defeat, leading to a demographic catastrophe among the male population. Genetic, archaeological, and historical studies indicate that the ancestors of approximately 90% of modern Europeans descended from people who migrated from the territory of Kazakhstan and the Black Sea region. Moreover, their primary genetic lines, haplogroups R1a and R1b, are of Asian origin. For this reason, there are solid grounds to assert that modern Europeans are the descendants of ancient Asian nomads.